Hello everyone, and welcome back to Questing Beast. It's been a little while since I've done a map video, so today I thought I would specialize in drawing one particular part of a map, and that's drawing mountains. So there's lots of different ways to draw mountains. I've seen lots of different varieties, lots of different techniques from different map makers, different cartographers on the Cartographers Guild, on places like the Reddit forums, and I've tried out lots of different ones recently, and I'm going to show you how to draw some of the different ones I've discovered that I particularly enjoy. So I'll start with some simple ones. This is the one that I tend to normally default to. It's one of the simplest ways to draw mountains. You simply got your triangles. It's a very quick way of doing it. Doesn't take a whole lot of effort, doesn't take a whole lot of time. You want them to overlap, makes them look a little bit more three-dimensional. This is pretty typical. It's a way to draw mountains. Now, drawing mountains in a style like this, you definitely want to vary their height. It tends to be taller toward the center of the mountain range, width-wise, and then you want to sort of slope down into foothills near the edges, like so. This gives it a little bit more of a naturalistic look. You can fill up a good deal of space with mountain ranges like this pretty quickly, and it easily reads as a mountain range. One thing that I'm going to be talking about with all these mountain ranges is that it's important to realize that mountain ranges aren't just a string of mountains in a row. We don't really see that in real life very often. Mountain ranges tend to be fairly thick. They tend to be a region of mountains spread across a large area. Now they do tend to form in ranges. They do tend to form in lines, usually along tectonic faults or other natural phenomena, usually where tectonic faults meet, or tectonic plates collide with each other. But they tend to be large mountainous regions. You're not going to find mountain ranges in the real world that's just one mountain after another. And I think a lot of us, when we started drawing maps, that was how we kind of instinctively drew them. But when you look at actual maps, look at the Rocky Mountains, for example. They're very long, they're thousands of miles long, but they're also very wide. They sweep through a big swath of the US. They're almost a whole state wide in some places. They can be quite wide, so it's really a region. And drawing that in your maps will really give it more veracity, because it'll look, it'll feel more true to life, basically. So we continue in a manner like this, but just going down. Okay. Because you want in your maps, you want to have areas that are mountainous. You want to have foothills, larger hills, rising up into mountains, and perhaps plateaus, and then going back down again. It adds more variety. So that's our simple way of doing that. There's some basic varieties or different variants on doing this simple mountain range. One simple way to add a little bit more flavor, do the same basic idea, but we can add shadows to them. This is quite a common thing to do. You kind of draw a line or a little ridge going down one side. You shade one side of that. This, of course, gives the impression that the mountains are being struck by sun coming from one direction. It also gives the texture of the mountains a little bit more interest, because you can see that there's, since the light isn't catching it in a straight line, you can tell there must be ridges and varieties of elevation within the mountain. So this is a simple solution if you want them to look a little bit more interesting. But of course, it takes a little bit more time. Now, most of the ways I'll be showing to draw mountains are going to be ways that are that look pretty good, I think, and are fairly quick to draw. You'll see on a lot of professional maps or on just some excellent amateur maps. Mountains that are very realistic, that seem like each mountain has been individually designed by the map maker, and those are beautiful. But of course they take a lot of time, and a lot of time they depend upon color in order to produce their effect, which is great, but I'm going to focus on ones that are fairly easy and simple to draw, that you can get started on right away. You might notice right off the bat that this looks a little bit more cartoony than that, but that can be a look that you go for anyway. Okay? So other little tips and tricks, little things that you can add. You can, for example, you're just drawing your basic triangular shapes. You can add snow. A good way to do that is just to create these kind of jagged lines coming down from the top to form a snow cap. And snow, of course, doesn't form a perfect cap. It runs along ridges, along crests, along the sides of the mountains. So that can be a good technique as well. If you look more snow-capped, your land will look more cold, I suppose. You're giving a good sense of what the weather in the area looks like. Otherwise, your mountains will just be bald, and people have to kind of guess what the temperature looks like. It's also a little bit more photorealistic. Of course, it's not actually photorealistic, but if you actually show the snow caps, that's a level of detail that really communicates what the mountains might look like. People will read it as more realistic. Okay. Now, another thing that you can do when you're doing shading and snow on the top, a simple solution to do both at once. You can have sort of large mountains like this. This works better with larger shaped mountains. Of course, the actual size of your mountain is going to depend on the scale that you want to come across. But then what you can do is you can just sort of designate the top areas as being snowy, and then just kind of shade the bottoms like this. Just with lines emanating away from the top. More darkness to the bottom to connote that there might be trees or darker rocks down there. But the top remains fairly white. So that gives a nice effect of snow-capped peaks as well. Another way that you can draw this, draw mountains, is by taking an even more detailed route. Go for not as straight as sides on our little cones here. Add some more detail. Remember that mountains sometimes have more than one peak. Layer them like so. And you can add the little ridges running down the sides of the mountains like this. Once you have that to your satisfaction, you do a little bit of shading. Usually on one side of these ridges, show that the sunlight is striking it from a particular angle. A lot of these mountain techniques I haven't actually used in my own maps very often. A lot of these I discovered while I was researching this video, and I'm excited to try some of these techniques in the next video that I make. So, drawing the mountains like this makes them look much more realistic, so we're sort of going increasing realism. Add a little bit more shading. course, at the expense of time. But your mountains will look more individual, they'll look more unique. On this end of the scale, we have mountains that are much more abstract, right? We wouldn't expect mountains to actually look like that, or for these mountains to even actually be placed exactly as we're drawing them. We're more just designating a zone of mountains. Whereas if you draw mountains more like this, they more hint at the fact that the mountains might actually be there in the way that you've drawn them, because you've taken a more realistic approach to drawing them. Okay. So let's look at some other ways. Most of these have been in a fake 3D technique. So we've sort of seen them on the side. Of course, most maps are looking down, straight down at the world, directly from above. So you wouldn't actually see them in 3D like this. But our eye tends to read them better as mountains. But there's also several ways you can draw mountains looking straight down from above that I think come across pretty well. So I'll show you a couple of those. One is a fairly simple way of doing this, is just to show a height map or an elevation map. That's where you draw concentric circles or concentric shapes to show different levels of altitude. Now this is a technique that a lot of surveyors use. You see it on a lot of more technically accurate maps because they just show elevation much more precisely. Each ring would represent a certain level of elevation off of sea level, I suppose. Now, when you're drawing mountains like this, your maps will look more technical. They'll look more precise. And when you do it like this, you really are giving your viewers the information that that's exactly where the mountains are, right? You're giving them very precise information about elevation. So this is for if you want a lot of precision and a lot of detail. Oftentimes, drawing mountains like this, the scale will be much larger. It'll be zoomed in a lot more if you're going to see individual mountains like that. It's very difficult to do terrain maps like this if you're zoomed out really far from a continent. Okay, let's look at a couple other ones. So another one, we can just draw the main ridges on the top of the mountain range. For example, bear with me here. This is the main ridge that's running through the mountain range. Now, throughout the mountain range, we add little ridges and slopes coming down off of some of the main mountains. I saw this technique used on a map, I believe it was for a Dungeons & Dragons professional map that was done for one of the source books. It looked really good. With something like this, you can add little smaller ridges coming down, branching off. This is a more detailed, straight down map. It's more visually appealing and less technical than that one. Something like this. And this is a technique that you could use to spread out across an area. You could do several of these mountain ranges branching off a little bit and spreading out over a large area, and you would have a region that looked very mountainous. A little more detail. Add some little ridges on the bottom to show roughly where the bottom of these mountains are. I think this is a useful technique to sort of denote where the terrain really starts rising. So you have a technique like that and you're pretty good to go. It looks like an area of mountains, at least it does to me. And it has more precision than ones like this up here, but also doesn't take as long as some of the more detailed mountains like that or that. You can always add more detail and add some shading and so on if it takes your fancy. You can do little ridges in the same sort of way. If you have areas where the land suddenly drops off or suddenly rises, you can do ridges. Kind of like that as well, which is a useful, quick way of showing drop-offs or rises in land. Now, this mountain technique works very well with drawing hills in a similar fashion. So hills can be drawn just like that. That's a good straight down view of hills. Now there's other more three-dimensional ways of doing hills. Simply do rolling hills like this. That works just fine. Those are more akin to those kinds of mountains. Less detailed, more cartoony, almost more minimalist. But they definitely read very easily as hills. You can also add hills with a little bit more detail, make them a little bit more rugged. Some shading on one side. And you have a more detailed area of hills. Hills, of course, can be by themselves, or you can use them as foothills leading up to mountains like that. Those two would go well together. The land sort of building up into these taller peaks. Okay. So we have other ways of doing this as well. We can take this technique and then tilt it a little bit so that we're looking at it more from the side. So same basic idea where we draw the sort of mountainous ridge. But then we just simply work on creating little slopes coming down from it. This is a pretty quick technique that has a nice effect. Not being terribly precise with this, but you can see how the effect would work. It's more sketchy, but it gets an idea of these interconnected mountains kind of running together, sloping up and down into one another. Similar effect to that. One moment. Move the light a little bit. There we go. Okay. So what else do we have? I would say those are my main techniques that I've been picking up. There's other things you can do. For example, you can kind of outline the area that you want to be mountainous. And then sort of create the main mountain ridge that's going through it. And then just draw from a sort of straight top-down angle how the mountains are connected, or the slopes of the mountains. It's a pretty quick technique as well. You can do something like that. It doesn't look that great. I prefer ones like that or that. They're a little bit more detailed, a little bit more artistic. It's hard to make this one look as good, so I don't recommend that one as much. Of course, the other technique is actually drawing in very detailed mountains or using a lot of color. I've seen a lot of people just use basically have a flat surface on their map and then just paint in white and grayish areas, and then use textures that look more rough, like rubble or rock, and just kind of paint them over. And that reads as a mountain very nicely. It doesn't give a great sense of height unless you really put in white area, but it reads well on a color map. In a black and white map, I really recommend a technique like this, either one that looks 3D, so it looks like you're seeing the mountains from the side, or one that looks coming straight down, possibly like that. I think that one works really well. Of course, you can also do this one with some shading, which takes a little bit more time, but it can look very nice. So for example, requires you being a little bit more loose with how you're drawing. Perhaps leaving some white area near the top of these mountains to sort of hint at snow. It's kind of spidery shaped. But it's a good idea to have the mountains connected in some way. Mountains tend to they run together. Mountains don't stand apart in real life, or very rarely. And this is a rather rough sketch, but I think you can kind of see what I'm doing here. We have an area that looks very mountainous now. Now this definitely takes a lot longer. But you can have a very nice effect. Quite a region that looks wrinkled and very rough from above. So again, it all depends on the technique that you're going for, but these are all definitely different ways that you can try and do maps. Try to do mountains for maps. Oh, this one did not turn out well at all. Ignore that one. That one's no good. The other ones are quite good though, or pretty good representations of the sort of things I'm looking for when I draw my own maps, depending on the field that I'm looking for. All right, if you found this useful, let me know, and thanks for watching.